3 weeks after I left home for an important court case, my daughter called me at dawn, crying, "Dad, there was a fire. Mom didn't make it." I rushed home, but everything was already over. The funeral was finished. The cremation had been approved. The only thing waiting for me was a small gray urn on the fireplace. "Mom is in there," my daughter whispered. I reached for it with trembling hands, until one tiny detail made every instinct inside me tell me this nightmare wasn't over. If you've made it this far on Revenge Dad, thank you. It means more than you know. Now tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this? Your city, your country. I want to know. I'm not alone in this. Note, some elements here are fictional, shaped for meaning and reflection. The names and places are coincidental. The lessons are not. I remember the exact morning it all began because I had been happy. That is the thing no one tells you about the worst days of your life. They usually start out ordinary, even good. The coffee was strong. The light coming through the kitchen window was the particular gold of a Los Angeles August, the kind that makes everything look like it was painted by someone who loved the place. And Helen was in the garden. I stood at the sink watching her through the glass. She was wearing her blue cotton shirt, the one with the fraying collar she refused to throw away, because she said it had character. She was talking to the roses. She did that, held quiet conversations with them, while she worked as if they were old friends who needed catching up. I had teased her about it for years. That morning, I just watched. 38 years of marriage, and she could still do that to me. Make me stop what I was doing just to look at her. "You're staring again," she said without turning around. She always knew. "Occupational habit," I called back through the screen door. "I spent 30 years watching people who didn't know they were being watched." She laughed and deadheaded a bloom that had gone past its time, dropping it into the basket at her feet. "Well, I'm not a suspect, Tom. Go finish your coffee. My name is Thomas Reed. I am 65 years old. For 30 years, I worked as a federal investigator, specializing in financial fraud, the kind of crime that happens in spreadsheets and wire transfers and boardrooms, and offshore accounts in the quiet spaces where greed meets opportunity. I retired 3 years ago, to this house in Pasadena, California, to this garden, to this woman. I had thought that was the end of the story, the good ending. I was wrong. The call from Washington came on a Tuesday. Gerald Whitmore, a federal prosecutor I had worked with twice in the 90s, now heading a task force targeting a multi-state investment fraud scheme that had bilked retirees across 6 states out of a combined $42 million. They needed an expert witness, someone who could explain complex financial structures to a jury in plain English, who had credibility on the stand, who understood exactly how the scheme had been constructed and where the money had gone. "It'll be 2 months, maybe, a little less," Gerald said. "We'd cover everything, flights, hotel, per diem. Tom, this case needs you. These are people who lost everything, widows, veterans, people who trusted the wrong advisor." I told him I'd think about it. That evening I sat with Helen at the kitchen table after dinner, the way we always did, and I told her about the call. She set down her tea and looked at me with that particular expression she had, calm, careful, already 3 steps ahead. "You want to go," she said. It was not a question. I didn't say that. "Tom," she reached across and touched the back of my hand. "You've been retired for 3 years. You love this house. You love the garden. You love me." A small smile. "But you miss the work. Anyone who knows you can see it." She was not wrong. Retirement had been good. But there were mornings when I woke up with the specific restlessness of a man whose mind had been trained to solve problems and now had very few to solve. I missed the focus, the clarity of a case coming together. "I don't want to leave you alone for 2 months, I said. "Then don't," she said. "Technically." That was when Rachel called. The timing was so precise that I have wondered since whether it was planned. But that evening, sitting in the kitchen with Helen, my phone lit up with our daughter's name, and I answered it, and Rachel said she'd been thinking she felt terrible about how rarely she'd visited lately, how caught up she'd been in her own life, and would it be all right if she stayed with Mom while Dad was in Washington, just to spend some time? Make up for lost ground. Rachel was 34 years old. She lived in Silver Lake with her husband Evan Morris, who worked as a real estate broker. They had been married 6 years. She was bright and capable, and I had always thought fundamentally good. I had been proud of her. "That would be wonderful," Helen said before I could respond. She was looking at me with an expression that said, "See problem solved." Rachel, we'd love that. After she hung up, Helen refilled my coffee without being asked. She always knew when I needed it and said, "Go to Washington, Tom. Do something that matters. The roses will wait. I'll wait." I booked the flight the next morning. The day I left, our neighbor Carol Brennan came by to drop off a jar of her preserved lemons. She and Helen had been friends for 11 years, the kind of friendship built on shared meals and borrowed tools, and the particular intimacy of two women who have watched each other's lives from across a fence line. Carol hugged Helen for a long time on the front porch, and then she looked at me over Helen's shoulder with an expression I did not fully register until much later. "You take care of yourself, Helen," Carol said, stepping back. "Don't let that daughter of yours boss you around." She said it lightly, the way you say things you mean, but have learned to wrap in humor. Helen laughed and waved her off. I loaded my bag into the car. Helen walked out to the driveway. She was wearing the blue shirt again. Her hair was loose the way I liked it, and the morning light caught the gray at her temples that she had stopped trying to hide a few years ago, and that I thought was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. "Call me when you land," she said. "Every night," I said. She straightened my collar. It did not need straightening. She just wanted to touch me and said, "Go put criminals in prison, Tom Reed." I kissed her. I got in the car. I drove to LAX. At the gate waiting to board, I sent her a text rose count when I get back. She replied in under a minute. 17 new blooms this week. You'll have to verify in person. I smiled at my phone like a man with nowhere better to be. I boarded the plane. I found my seat. The city tilted and shrank below me as we climbed the sprawl of Los Angeles, going gold in the morning light. The foothills brown and dry at the end of summer, the thin blue line of the Pacific at the edge of everything. I looked for Pasadena, but could not find it from that height. I told myself it did not matter. I would be back in 2 months. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was Rachel, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew the world had changed. Rachel was crying. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed, and I am not proud of this, because it tells you something about the way my mind was built, was that the crying had a rhythm to it, controlled, measured. The pauses came at the right moments, the breath caught in exactly the right places. 30 years of interviewing people under stress had taught me what genuine panic sounds like, and genuine panic does not have rhythm. I pushed the thought away before it fully formed. I was not an investigator that morning. I was a husband, and my husband's brain had already registered the word mom in Rachel's first broken syllable, and it had stopped functioning normally. "Dad." Her voice came through the phone like something tearing. "Dad, something happened. Something I need you to listen to me." I sat up in the hotel bed. The Washington, D.C. skyline was gray outside the window. Early morning, the Capitol dome barely visible through cloud cover. I had been up since 5 reviewing my testimony notes. I was due in the courtroom at 9. None of that existed anymore. "Rachel, talk to me." "It's Mom." A sharp intake of breath. "Dad, there was a fire at the Silmar property, the old cabin out in the valley. She went out there yesterday afternoon. I don't know why she said she needed to check on something, and the electrical system, they think it was the wiring and it spread so fast. Dad, by the time anyone called it in, she couldn't or then I heard the rest of what she said. I heard every word. But there is a mechanism in the human brain. I have read about it. I have seen it in witnesses on the stand. I have never understood it until that moment that simply refuses to process certain information. It takes the words and holds them at arm's length like a man holding a burning thing not yet ready to let it touch him. "She couldn't get out," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "The investigators are still on scene." Rachel was steadying herself the way people do when they have already cried and now need to function. "They said the remains, Dad, she was there, wasn't much left. The fire burned very hot, very fast. They said visual identification wasn't possible. Then how do they know it's her? Her car was there, her phone, her wedding ring, they found it in the debris. And I gave them her dental records this morning. Her dentist is Dr. Kellerman. I had his number from her files. They confirmed it, Dad. They confirmed it." I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. At some point I had stood up and then sat back down. I didn't remember doing either. Helen had texted me 2 days ago. A photo of the roses' 17 new blooms, she'd said, and I needed to verify in person. I had been planning to call her that evening. I had been thinking about what I would say. I had a whole conversation ready. The cremation. Rachel said gently. The way you say something you have rehearsed. Mom had instructions, Dad. I found them in her desk. She'd written everything down. She wanted immediate cremation, no viewing. She always said she didn't want to be remembered lying in a box. I've already spoken to the funeral home. Under California law as next of kin, I was able to authorize it. I thought it was what she would have wanted. I hope that's okay. In California, there is no mandatory waiting period for cremation once the death certificate is filed and next of kin authorization is obtained. Rachel would have known this, or found it out quickly. She had handled it in under 48 hours. I did not think about that then. I thought about Helen's blue shirt. I thought about the roses. I'm coming home, I said. Of course. Gerald will understand. I'll have Evan pick you up from LAX. I did not want Evan to pick me up. I did not want anyone to pick me up. I booked the first available flight on my laptop and took a taxi to the airport and sat in the terminal for 3 hours, staring at a gate display that kept changing. The house in Pasadena felt wrong the moment I walked in. Not wrong in the way a house feels when someone has broken in, or rearranged things wrong in the way a house feels when the person who made it a home is no longer breathing inside it. The air was the same. The furniture was the same. Helen's reading glasses were still on the side table by the couch, one arm slightly bent where she'd set them down, in a hurry the way she always did. Rachel had placed the urn on the fireplace mantel. It was gray simple, smaller than I expected. Beside it, she had put Helen's favorite photograph of us, our 30th anniversary trip to Carmel, Helen, in a yellow sundress laughing at something off-camera the Pacific behind her. I stood in front of that mantel for a long time. I don't know how long. At some point, I reached out and picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. On the base, a small adhesive label listed the cremation date as September 20th. The fire had been reported on September 19th. I set it back down. I told myself the paperwork sometimes ran a day behind. I told myself there were explanations. I told myself a lot of things that night. Rachel stood behind me with her hand on my arm, and Evan was somewhere in the kitchen making coffee I had not asked for. Carol Brennan came that afternoon. She let herself in through the back door the way she had done for 11 years, and she found me sitting in Helen's chair, and she sat down across from me and took my hands in hers, and we did not need to say anything for a while. Then she said it. Tom, her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman choosing words. Helen would never go out to that property alone. You know that. In 15 years of being her neighbor, she didn't even like driving the freeway alone after dark. She always had you, or she called me to go with her. I looked at Carol. Her eyes were red, and her face was set in an expression I recognized from interviews, the expression of someone who has information they are not sure they should give. Carol, I said. My throat felt like gravel. Please! She stopped. She squeezed my hands. She did not say anything else. I cannot explain to you even now why I did not listen to her. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about it. The professional answer is that grief does something specific to the investigative mind. It does not shut it down. It redirects it, turns all that analytical energy inward toward self-examination, toward guilt, toward the inventory of everything you should have done differently. The personal answer is simpler and harder. I could not listen to Carol because listening meant considering the alternative, and I was not ready for the alternative. Helen was gone. My wife of 38 years was in that gray urn on my mantel, and I had been 2,000 miles away talking about someone else's fraud case when she died alone. I accepted that because I had to, because the other option, the option where the urn was wrong, where the confirmed dental records were wrong, where my daughter who was standing in my kitchen making coffee was not what she appeared to be, that option was too large and too dark to look at directly. Not that morning. Not yet. That night after Rachel and Evan left, I sat alone in the living room in the dark. The urn on the mantel caught the streetlight through the window, a small gray shape completely still. I should have called you yesterday, I said. My voice sounded strange in the empty room. I kept meaning to call, and then the preparation for testimony ran long, and I told myself I'd call after dinner, and then it was late and I thought. I stopped, pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. I'm sorry, Helen. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. The house held the silence the way houses do. I stayed in that chair until almost 2 a.m. Then I got up, covered the photograph with a folded dish towel because I could not look at her face and sleep, and went to bed. The next morning, Rachel came back with coffee and a list of things that needed to be handled: estate paperwork, insurance notifications, account transfers. She was efficient and kind, and she held my hand when I cried, and she said all the right things. I let her handle them, every single one. That was my first mistake. It would not be my last. The first check I wrote Rachel was for $900. She called it a processing fee paperwork associated with the cremation, administrative costs the funeral home hadn't itemized up front. She was apologetic about asking the way people are when they know the ask is reasonable, but the timing is bad. I wrote the check at the kitchen table without asking for documentation. I didn't ask for a receipt. I didn't ask for the funeral home's name. I understand now that she was testing me. The $900 was not about money. It was about establishing a pattern, training me the way you train a dog with small repetitions until the behavior becomes automatic. I had sent career criminals to federal prison for doing exactly this. I had testified about it in court, explained it to juries in plain language, described the psychology of incremental financial manipulation to judges who needed to understand why intelligent people fall for it. I knew the playbook by heart. Grief, I have learned, is a more effective blindfold than stupidity ever was. Rachel visited twice a week through October. She brought food casseroles, soup in mason jars, the kind of cooking that says, "I am taking care of you," without requiring conversation. She sat with me while I ate. She listened when I talked about Helen. She cried at the right moments. She was by every visible measure a devoted daughter doing everything right. The second request came 12 days after the first. A medical copay bill Helen had apparently overlooked before she died, $420 flagged for collection. Rachel had intercepted the notice in the mail and didn't want me to deal with the stress of it. I transferred the money from my checking account that afternoon. The third request came a week later. A property tax adjustment on Helen's name, $1,100 due by month's end, or it would accrue penalties. I paid it without verifying the parcel number. I see the pattern clearly now laid out in my own bank statements like a confession. Each amount slightly larger than the last. Each explanation slightly more complex, slightly more urgent, slightly more designed to make asking questions feel like adding to my own burden. And each time I paid, Rachel thanked me with exactly the right combination of gratitude and relief, enough to feel genuine, not so much that it felt performed. By mid-November, I had given her just over $6,000 across 9 separate transactions. It was during those weeks that I developed what I can only describe as a ritual. Every morning I made coffee 2 scoops the way Helen made it, and I carried the mug to the fireplace, and I stood in front of the gray urn, and I told her about whatever was on my mind: the weather, the news, what I'd read the night before. It sounds like the behavior of a man losing his grip on reality. Looking back, I think it was the opposite. It was the only conversation in my life that felt honest. One Thursday morning in November, I drove to see Dr. Patricia Coleman. Patricia Coleman had been Helen's family physician for 14 years, a careful, unhurried woman in her mid-50s who practiced out of a small office in Arcadia, and who had over the years become something like a friend to Helen in the way that good doctors sometimes do. I went because I wasn't sleeping. My appetite was unreliable. I needed someone to tell me these things were normal. She took my blood pressure, asked the standard questions, renewed a prescription I'd been managing for years. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at me, the way doctors look at patients when they've decided to say the thing they're actually thinking. "How are you managing the estate?" she asked. "Rachel's handling most of it," I said. "She's been good about taking things off my plate." Dr. Coleman nodded slowly. "She moved very quickly on everything, didn't she?" She said it the way Carol Brennan had said things, not quite a question, not quite a statement, something in between. "Helen had instructions," I said. "Rachel followed them." "Of course." She picked up her pen, made a note I couldn't read. "You take care of yourself, Thomas. Come back in 3 weeks." I drove home thinking about the way she'd said it. She moved very quickly on everything. I filed it in the same drawer where I'd put Carol Brennan's unfinished sentence, and I closed the drawer and I made dinner, and I called Rachel to check in, and she answered on the second ring and asked how I was feeling, and I said fine, and she said she was glad and everything was exactly as it appeared to be, or so I told myself. 3 weeks into December, I was looking for Helen's password notebook. She kept a small spiral-bound pad in the top right drawer of her desk, with login information for our various accounts, because she had never trusted herself to remember them, and I had never trusted computers to store them securely. We had argued about this pleasantly for years. I was looking for the Netflix password of all things, because I couldn't sleep, and I wanted to watch something that didn't require thought. The notebook wasn't in the top right drawer. It was in the bottom left, which was unusual. I pulled it out. And underneath it in the back of the drawer, behind a rubber-banded stack of old birthday cards, I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside the envelope were 2 documents. The first was our original joint life insurance policy, a policy we had taken out together 22 years ago, with Metropolitan Life for $1.2 million. I was listed as the primary beneficiary. Helen was the insured. I had not looked at this document in years. There was no reason to. The second document was a beneficiary change form. Same policy number, same insurer. Signed or appearing to be signed by Helen. Dated March 14th, 2024, 6 months before the fire. The new primary beneficiary was Rachel Ann Reed. I sat down on the floor of Helen's study. Not in a chair on the floor with my back against the desk, the way I used to sit when I was working a case, and needed to think without the formality of a desk between me and the problem. Old habit. I looked at Helen's signature on the beneficiary change form. I looked at it for a long time. Helen had a distinctive H. She had learned calligraphy in her 30s, just for herself, just because she wanted to, and the H had never lost the influence of that period. It had a small, deliberate loop at the upper left corner, barely noticeable, the kind of mark that looks like a stylistic flourish unless you know to look for it. The signature on this form did not have the loop. March 14th, 2024. I ran the calendar backward. Rachel had changed the beneficiary 6 months before the fire, before I went to Washington, before she volunteered to stay with Helen. She had been planning this, whatever this was, long before any of us knew I would be out of town. The DC invitation hadn't given Rachel an opportunity. The DC invitation had given her a timeline. I sat on that floor for a long time. The house was quiet around me. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the window. Then I reached up to Helen's desk, found a legal pad in the top drawer, and uncapped a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote one word, Rachel. Then I started writing everything I remembered. I had not watched the 11 o'clock news in years. Helen had always been the one who kept up with local television, the weather forecasts, the community segments, the occasional human interest story that she would describe to me over breakfast the next morning, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in the goodness of strangers. I had always preferred the newspaper. We had argued about this pleasantly for the entirety of our marriage, and I had never once won. That night in mid-December, I turned on the television because I could not sleep, and I did not want to read, and I did not want to sit in the dark talking to the urn. The living room felt cavernous at 11 o'clock, the way rooms do when they are built for 2 people, and only one of them is left. I found the local news and sat with it the way you sit, with background noise present without paying attention. And then the segment changed. It was 30 seconds, maybe less. A field reporter standing near an overpass in the San Fernando Valley, the freeway behind her, loud and bright with headlights. A brief interview with a man whose face was obscured, homeless, the Chiron said, found sleeping near a property off Sylmar Road. He had turned in a piece of jewelry to the local fire station, hoping someone might claim it. The camera zoomed in on the evidence bag the reporter was holding. A silver necklace, simple chain, small pendant oval lightly engraved. I was off the couch before I understood why I was moving. I crossed the room in 4 steps and stood 18 inches from the television screen, and I looked at that pendant and the air left my body completely. H and T intertwined. The way I had asked the jeweler to engrave them 30 years ago for our 30th anniversary, because Helen had said she wanted something that looked like the 2 of us were still holding on to each other, even when we weren't in the same room. She had worn that necklace every day for 8 years. She had told me once that she sometimes forgot it was there, that it had become like a second heartbeat, something so constant she only noticed it when it was gone. It was not on the evidence inventory from the Sylmar fire. I knew this because I had requested a copy of the inventory 3 weeks earlier, the morning after I found the insurance document, telling myself I was just being thorough, telling myself it was just the old habit of a man who liked complete information. The inventory listed Helen's wedding ring, recovered from the debris, her cell phone partially melted, and her car keys. It listed the items found in the vehicle. It did not list a silver necklace with an H&T pendant, which meant it had not been at the fire. I called the television station at 11:43 that night. The overnight desk gave me the number for the news tip line. I left a message. At 7:15 the following morning, a segment producer called me back and gave me the name of the fire station where the necklace had been turned in and the name of the man who had found it, Jimmy Cortez. The fire station captain confirmed the name when I called 20 minutes later. By 8:30, I was in the car. The Hollywood division of the Los Angeles Police Department operates out of a building on Wilcox Avenue that has the institutional look of a place designed by someone who wanted to communicate authority without spending money on architecture. I had been inside it twice over the course of my career for meetings that no longer mattered. That morning, I asked for the detective handling non-emergency tip inquiries and was directed to a desk near the back wall where a woman in her early 40s was working through a stack of folders with the focused efficiency of someone who had already been at it for 2 hours. Detective Sarah Okafor looked up when I approached. She had close-cropped natural hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the expression of a person who dealt daily with members of the public who believed their problems were the most urgent thing in the building. Mr. Reed. She had already pulled up something on her computer, the tip line message I assumed. Sarah Okafor, sit down please. I sat. I explained the necklace. I explained the anniversary, the engraving, the fact that Helen had worn it without interruption for 8 years. I explained that it was not on the Sylmar fire evidence inventory, which I had obtained through a public records request under California Government Code, Section 6.2.5.0. Any person may request records from a state or local agency, and fire investigation reports and associated evidence inventories fall within that provision. Detective Okafor listened without interrupting. She was good at listening. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk and looked at me directly. Mr. Reed, she said, I'm sorry for your loss. I want to be straightforward with you because I think you're a man who appreciates that. She paused. Jewelry goes missing from fire scenes. It happens more than the public knows sometimes, in the chaos of the initial response. Sometimes during cleanup, sometimes because someone picked something up without understanding what they had. The fact that this necklace wasn't on the inventory doesn't necessarily indicate it was never there. It indicates it was never logged, I said. Yes, which could mean a number of things. She held my gaze steadily. She was not dismissing me. She was being accurate, which I respected even as it frustrated me. The location where it was found near Sylmar Road is approximately a quarter mile from the fire site. A necklace could travel that distance in water runoff and debris removal in the boots of a first responder who didn't realize something had attached itself. My wife never took that necklace off, I said. In 8 years. People do things they don't normally do when their routines are disrupted. She picked up her pen. I'm going to make a note of this and flag it to the investigator who handled the original scene. I can't promise it goes further than that. I don't have grounds for anything more at this stage. But I want you to know, I'm not ignoring you. She wrote something on a yellow notepad. I could not read it from where I was sitting. I thanked her. I stood up. I walked out of the Hollywood division and sat in my car on Wilcox Avenue for 17 minutes without starting the engine. She was right. Everything she had said was technically correct. A quarter mile of distance, a necklace that could have traveled in any number of ways, no evidence of anything beyond a gap in an evidence log. In 30 years of work, I had argued the other side of that reasoning more times than I could count, had stood in front of juries and explained why the absence of an item from a log did not by itself prove anything. But I had also spent 30 years learning the difference between an absence that meant nothing and an absence that meant everything. And the specific shape of this absence, a piece of jewelry worn daily for 8 years, not listed, found 3 months later near a location with no connection to the fire site, had a shape I recognized. I pulled out the legal pad from the passenger seat. Underneath Rachel at the top, I added 2 new lines. Necklace not on inventory. Why? Jimmy Cortez, Sylmar Road. Find him. I started the engine. The fire station captain on Sylmar Road gave me 2 things. A confirmation that the necklace had been turned in by a man named Jimmy Cortez, and a general location, the overpass at Sepulveda and Roxford, where a small encampment had existed for the better part of 2 years. He also gave me a warning delivered with the particular weariness of a man who had learned not to expect people to take his advice. Mr. Reed, I'd recommend going through official channels if you want to speak with him. We have outreach workers who know these folks. It's better than just showing up. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. I showed up anyway. The encampment was smaller than I expected, 3 or 4 structures, if you could call them, that assembled from salvage materials under the shadow of the overpass. The morning was cold for Los Angeles, low 50s, the kind of damp December chill that gets into your bones in a way that dry heat never does. The freeway above was already loud at 9 in the morning, a constant presence like white noise with weight to it. I asked for Jimmy Cortez by name. A woman near the entrance of the first structure looked at me for a moment, taking measure, and then pointed toward the far end of the overpass without a word. He was sitting on an upturned milk crate next to a shopping cart, drinking coffee from a paper cup, with the focused attention of a man who had learned to take pleasure in small, reliable things. He was 52 years old, but looked older in the way that outdoor living ages a person weathered skin-deep lines around his eyes, hands that had done hard work for a long time. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt under a canvas jacket, and his boots were well maintained. Some people let themselves go. Jimmy Cortez had not. Jimmy Cortez, I said. He looked up. His eyes were clear and direct. Whatever else the years had taken from him, they had not taken that. Depends on who's asking. I told him my name. I told him my wife's name. I told him about the necklace, what it looked like, what the engraving meant when I had given it to her. I did not tell him about the fire or the urn on my mantle or the beneficiary change form in the manila envelope in my desk drawer. I had learned long ago that witnesses give you better information when you give them less to work with. Let them tell you what they saw. Don't contaminate it with what you already know. Jimmy Cortez listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his coffee cup on the ground beside the milk crate and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Iraq, he said. 2 tours, Sergeant 3rd Infantry Division, Fort Stewart, Georgia before that. He said it the way veterans sometimes introduce themselves to strangers, not as biography, but as credential. This is what I am. This is what I've seen. You can trust what I tell you. I got home in '09. Marriage didn't survive it. House went in the divorce. I've been out here going on 4 years now. He looked at me steadily. I tell you that because I want you to know I'm not somebody who imagines things. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I've been wondering for 3 months whether I should have done more about it. Something in my chest tightened. Tell me, I said. The night I found the necklace, it was the end of September, early October. I lose track sometimes. Middle of the night, maybe 2 in the morning. I was sleeping near the fence line on the south side of that property on Silmar Road, the abandoned ranch. I sleep out that way sometimes when the overpass gets loud. It's quieter and the ground softer. He picked up his coffee again, held it without drinking. I heard a vehicle, big engine truck or a van. Headlights came through the fence slats and woke me up. What did you do? Stayed still. You learn to stay still when you don't know what's coming. I watched through the fence. He paused. There were 2 of them, a woman and a man. The woman was maybe mid-30s, blonde hair, light-colored jacket. The man was taller, bigger through the shoulders. They had someone with them. My hands resting on my knees, pressed down without my intending them to. An older woman, Jimmy continued. She wasn't walking right, her feet were moving, but she wasn't supporting her own weight. They were holding her up, one on each side. Somebody had given her something, I think, to make her quiet. I've seen that before overseas, the way a person moves when they've been sedated. Did she resist? She tried. His jaw tightened briefly. When they got to the vehicle, it was a van, dark color. I couldn't tell you the make. She turned her head, like she was looking for something. Or someone. He stopped. Jimmy. My voice came out lower than I intended. What did she say? He looked at me for a long moment. The freeway roared above us. Somewhere behind us, someone in the encampment was cooking something on a camp stove, and the smell of it drifted past, incongruously domestic. She said it twice, Jimmy said, before the door closed. She was saying it when the door closed, I think, but I couldn't hear it anymore after that. He met my eyes. Tom the Roses, Tom the Roses. The world did not stop. I want to be precise about this because people say that the world stopped, and it is not accurate. The world continued in exactly the same way it always had. The freeway was loud. The December air was cold. Jimmy Cortez was looking at me with an expression that combined sorrow and relief, in equal measure the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally found the right person to give it to. What stopped was something inside me, some last remaining partition between what I had been willing to consider and what I now could not avoid. Helen had known. In the moment they were taking her, with whatever they had given her, pulling at her consciousness, she had known that if there was any chance of being found, it would come through me, and that if it came through me, it would come, because someone had heard her and passed it on, and so she had given them something to pass, something specific enough that only I would understand it, something that would survive being repeated by a stranger, the roses, our roses. The garden she talked to every morning, the 17 blooms she had texted me about 2 days before she disappeared, the last normal thing between us. She had not been screaming for help. She had been leaving me a trail. The 2 people with her, I said. My voice was steady. I had trained it to be steady. The woman with the blonde hair and the light jacket, the tall man. Can you describe them in more detail? Jimmy could. He was precise and unhurried about it, the way soldiers sometimes are trained to observe, trained to report. By the time he finished, I had no remaining doubt about who he was describing. The blonde hair, the light jacket, the specific way she moved, the height and build of the man beside her. Rachel, Evan. I thanked Jimmy Cortez. I shook his hand. I meant both things completely. Walking back to my car, I passed the woman who had pointed me toward him. She was watching me with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading strangers quickly. He's a good man, she said. Whatever he told you, it's true. Jimmy doesn't make things up. I know, I said. I believe him. I sat in the car. I did not analyze this time. I did not make notes. I pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel, and I breathed carefully the way you breathe when you're trying to keep something enormous from breaking through the surface before you are ready to deal with it. Helen was alive. She had been alive in September. She might be alive right now. And my daughter had put her somewhere. I picked up my phone. I found the contact I needed, a name I had not called in 2 years. A man I had known for 4 decades, a lawyer who owed me nothing and would do anything I asked. Michael Grant answered on the first ring. Thomas, he said, just my name. But the way he said it, the particular attentiveness of a man who has known you long enough to hear distress in a single syllable, told me he was already listening with everything he had. I need you, I said. Tonight. Bring everything you have on civil discovery procedure in California. And Michael? I stopped, looked through the windshield at the overpass, at the thin winter light cutting through the concrete columns. Don't tell anyone I called. Michael Grant's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on Avenue of the Stars in Century City, which is the kind of address that tells you something about a lawyer before you've met him. The building had valet parking and a lobby with marble floors and a security desk, staffed by a man in a blazer who called upstairs before letting me through. At 9:30 on a December evening, the elevator was empty and the hallway was quiet, and Michael was waiting for me at the door to his suite with his jacket off and his reading glasses already on, and 2 yellow legal pads on the conference table behind him. 40 years. That was how long I had known Michael Grant. We had met in 1984 at a federal training seminar in Quantico. He was a young attorney consulting on a white-collar case. I was a new investigator trying to understand how prosecutors thought. We had argued about evidentiary standards for 3 hours and gone to dinner afterward and been friends ever since. He had been at my wedding. I had been at both of his. He had held my hand at my mother's funeral, and I had held his at his father's, and in the way of men who have known each other long enough, we had stopped needing to explain ourselves to each other about most things. He looked at me when I walked in and said, "You look terrible." "I know," I said. "Sit down, tell me everything." I told him everything. It took 40 minutes. Michael did not interrupt. He sat across the conference table with a legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he wrote things down in the rapid shorthand he had developed over decades of taking notes in rooms where he could not afford to miss anything. When I finished, he set the pen down and pushed his reading glasses up onto his forehead and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem he finds genuinely interesting. "The beneficiary change," he said. "You have the original document, photographed and in my cloud account, original locked in my desk." "Good," he made a note. "The Chiron on the news segment, Jimmy Cortez, is a named individual. We can get a formal statement from him if we need one. His background as a veteran with combat experience will hold up well in front of a jury if it comes to that jury's trust people who've served." He tapped the legal pad. "The evidence inventory gap, you got that? Through a public records request? Government Code 6250I confirmed." which means it's documented that the necklace was not logged. That's useful. He leaned back. Thomas, I want to walk you through what I think we can do here, because some of it is going to feel slow, and I need you to understand why it has to be slow. Tell me, you were the original primary beneficiary on that life insurance policy. Rachel changed it with what appears to be a forged signature 6 months before your wife disappeared. That gives you standing legal grounds to file a civil action, contesting the beneficiary change and the insurance payout. He held up a hand before I could speak. I know that's not the point. The point is Helen, but the civil action gives us something the police investigation doesn't have, yet it gives us discovery. Under California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 2016, parties in a civil lawsuit can subpoena financial records, bank statements, transaction histories. We can see everything Rachel and Evan have done with that money, and more importantly, we can see everything they paid for before the fire. I had spent 30 years understanding how financial trails worked. I had built cases on bank statements that told stories their owners never intended to tell. I knew exactly what Michael was describing, and I knew exactly how powerful it was. How long to file? I asked. I can have the complaint drafted by tomorrow morning. We'll name Metropolitan Life as a nominal defendant they paid out based on the forged change they have an interest in knowing if it was fraudulent. That strengthens our standing. He picked up his pen again. I'll also need you to formally request a copy of the complete fire investigation report, not just the evidence inventory, the full report. There will be things in there I want to see. I had already requested it. It arrived the next morning along with the subpoenas Michael filed through the court. We spread everything across the conference table and we read. It took most of the night. The fire investigation report was thorough in the way bureaucratic documents are thorough, comprehensive in its measurements and observations, cautious in its conclusions. The origin of the fire was listed as undetermined, possibly electrical, not confirmed electrical. Possibly. It was the kind of qualifier that gets inserted when an investigator is not certain, but also not prepared to say something more alarming without more evidence. The camera footage section was what stopped me first. 3 traffic cameras covered the Sylmar Road corridor at the relevant times. Camera 1 at the intersection of Sylmar and Hubbard had captured a vehicle consistent with Helen's registered car, traveling eastbound at 2:47 in the afternoon on the day of the fire. The driver was not visible, son, angle the report noted made facial identification impossible from that angle at that time of day. That's convenient, Michael said when I read it aloud. Someone knew the camera position, I said, or got lucky. I looked at the timestamp again. Helen drove that road herself at 2:47, or someone drove her car after her. Or both, Michael said. The property record was what broke open the cabin question. I had assumed everyone had assumed, including apparently the fire investigators, that the cabin was a Reed family property, a weekend retreat of some kind. The insurance claim Rachel had filed listed it as such, describing it as secondary residential property, Thomas and Helen Reed. But the LA County Assessor records attached to Michael's subpoena told a different story. The property at the Sylmar Road address was owned by a real estate investment trust with a street address in Burbank. It had been listed for sale 11 months earlier with Evan Morris of Pacific Coast Realty as the listing agent. Evan had legal access to the property access codes, keys authorization to enter for showings. The property had received no offers. It was still technically on the market. He used a property he had a legal right to enter, Michael said. He said it quietly, the way you say things that are worse the more you think about them. A place that had no connection to your family. A place where if anyone investigated the trail would lead back to an investment trust in Burbank and stop there. Unless someone looked at the listing agent, I said. Unless someone looked at the listing agent. He paused. Thomas, the dental records. Rachel provided them to the medical examiner's office directly. The report confirms that. There was no independent verification. The examiner's office accepted them as provided. I had been waiting for that. So if the records were altered, then the identification is worthless. Michael took off his reading glasses entirely and set them on the table. We need an independent DNA analysis of the remains. That is the next step. That is the most important step. He looked at me directly. Because if those remains are not Helen's, if someone else died in that fire, then we are not dealing with insurance fraud and a missing person. We are dealing with something considerably worse. Neither of us said the word. We did not need to. I thought about Margaret Flores, though I did not know her name yet. I thought about the shape of a woman I had never met, whoever she was, who had ended up in a burning building on Silmar Road because my daughter needed a body. "File the DNA request," I said. "Tonight, if you can. I'll have it to the lab by morning. We'll frame it as a requirement of the civil discovery. The insurance payout was based on identification of remains, and we are contesting the validity of that identification." He made the note. "Thomas," he stopped writing. "If Helen is alive and being held somewhere, every day matters." "I know. Then I need you to do something difficult. I need you to keep calling Rachel. Keep acting the way you have been acting, grieving confused dependent. The moment she suspects you know something, whatever leverage we have disappears." I thought about the $900 check, the casseroles, Rachel sitting across from me while I talked about Helen, her eyes perfectly calibrated to the right expression of sympathetic grief. "That," I said, "will not be difficult at all." Michael almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He picked up his pen and kept working, and I sat across from him, and we read through the night, and by the time the Century City skyline began to lighten outside the window, we had the shape of something that was going to bring my daughter to her knees. The orchid had been sitting in Helen's study for 11 years, and I had not watered it once since she disappeared. It was alive anyway. Stubbornly, inexplicably alive, one pale bloom still holding on at the end of a long stem, the soil dry as chalk around it. Helen used to say orchids were the most honest plants she knew. "They don't pretend to be fine when they're not," she told me once. "They just hold on and wait for someone to notice." I noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon in late December. While I was going through her desk, looking for the title to her car part of the estate paperwork Rachel had been gently pressing me to complete. I had been putting it off. Walking into Helen's study still required a specific kind of preparation, the way you brace yourself before stepping into cold water. I watered the orchid. Then I stood there looking at it, and something made me lift the pot. The notebook was underneath, wedged between the drainage tray and the saucer. Small cloth covered, the kind sold in sets of 3 at any bookstore. Helen had filled it in her careful teacher's handwriting, the handwriting she had spent 31 years making legible enough for 8-year-olds to read. I sat on the floor, and I read it. The early entries were ordinary notes about her garden, a recipe she wanted to try, a book recommendation from Carol Brennan. Then, somewhere around February of 2024, the tone changed. Rachel came by again today. She asked about the Fidelity account, how it's structured, whether both signatures are needed for withdrawals. I told her I'd have to ask Tom. She seemed frustrated. Evan waited in the car the entire time. He didn't come in. A week later, she called about the life insurance, asked whether Tom had ever updated the beneficiary information. I said I didn't know. She said she was just trying to help us plan ahead. I said we didn't need help planning ahead. And then, in April, I found a document on the printer that Rachel must have forgotten. It looked like a beneficiary change form. My name was on it, and a signature that was supposed to be mine. I don't know what to do with this. I don't want to tell Tom before the trial he has enough. But I'm frightened. I keep telling myself she's my daughter. I keep telling myself I must be wrong. I stopped reading, pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, kept going. The last entry was dated the evening before Rachel had called her about the cabin. Helen's handwriting was slightly less steady than usual, not much, just enough for me to notice. She called again this afternoon, says there's a deed that needs my signature at the Silmar property, something about the title transfer. She says it can't wait. She says she'll meet me there. I've asked her twice why it can't be handled at a title company, and she keeps changing the subject. I don't want to go. I have not wanted to go anywhere with Rachel alone for months. But she's my daughter, and I keep thinking if I'm wrong about this, I will have done something unforgivable. So, I'll go. I'll go and I'll watch, and if something feels wrong, I'll find a way to tell Tom. He taught me how. He taught me years ago, the signal with the H. I haven't forgotten. The last line, the very last thing she wrote. "Please come home soon, Tom. I'm not as brave as you think I am." I sat on the floor of her study for a long time. The orchid was above me on the desk, still holding its single bloom. Outside it was dark. I had been in the room longer than I realized. The city was quiet the way Los Angeles is never really quiet, just quieter. Helen had known. She had carried it for months alone, trying to protect me from it. She had walked into that cabin knowing something was wrong, and she had gone anyway because she was Helen Reed, and Helen Reed did not run from her own daughter without being certain. I closed the notebook carefully, set it on the desk beside the orchid. Then I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood at the counter until I was ready to be the man she needed me to be. Robert Castillo arrived at Michael's office on a Thursday morning in early January, carrying a leather document case and the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent decades working crime scenes, people who have learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't directly relevant to the problem in front of them. He was 58 compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of hands that looked like they had been used hard for a long time. He had spent 22 years with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives before retiring to private consulting. Michael had worked with him twice before on cases involving suspicious commercial fires. He came with a reputation for being unwilling to reach conclusions his evidence didn't support, which in this context was exactly what I needed. He set the document case on the conference table, opened it, and spread 8 photographs across the surface without preamble. I reviewed the LAFD report, the evidence inventory, and the site photographs from the original investigation, he said. I also reviewed the fire marshal's supplemental notes, which are available through your civil discovery request. He tapped the first photograph, an aerial view of the cabin site taken from a drone in the aftermath. The official conclusion was undetermined origin, possibly electrical. I disagree with that conclusion. Why? Michael asked. Castillo pointed to 2 areas on the photograph, separated by roughly 20 feet. 2 distinct ignition points. The original investigators identified one here near the breaker panel on the north wall. They attributed it to an electrical fault and stopped there. His finger moved. This second point here near the exterior wall on the east side, it appears in the site photographs, but was not addressed in the report. The char pattern is inconsistent with a fire that spread from the north wall. The burn intensity at this location indicates a separate ignition. He pulled a second photograph. Closer view the east wall. Even to my untrained eye, the darkening of the wood had a different character, deeper, more concentrated, spreading outward from a low point rather than downward from above. Liquid accelerant, Castillo said. Almost certainly, the pore pattern is visible and the char accelerant burns faster and hotter than structural materials, and it leaves a signature in the wood grain that experienced investigators know to look for. He paused. The original investigator may have missed it, or he may have lacked the time to examine the east wall thoroughly before the site was released. I can't tell you which. What can you tell us? I asked. Castillo looked at me directly. He had the steady gaze of someone accustomed to delivering information that people did not want to hear. I can tell you this fire was set. 2 ignition points, one using an available electrical fault as cover, one using a liquid accelerant applied to the exterior wall. Whoever did this understood the basics of fire behavior. They knew the electrical fault would draw the investigators' attention. But they were not a professional. A professional would have used a delay mechanism. This was direct ignition, which means whoever set it was present when it started or left immediately before. He folded his hands on the table. Under California Penal Code Section 451, this constitutes felony arson, the intentional burning of a structure. That carries a sentence of 2 to 9 years. And if there was someone in the structure when it burned? Michael asked. Castillo did not hesitate. Then we are discussing felony murder under Penal Code Section 189. The arson murder rule in California holds that a death caused during the commission of arson constitutes second-degree murder regardless of intent to kill. That is a sentence of 15 years to life. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people avoiding something, but the specific quiet of 3 people absorbing the full weight of what had just been confirmed. I looked at the photographs on the table, the collapsed east wall, the concentrated burn pattern, the evidence of a hand. Rachel's hand, Evan's hand, some combination of both, applying accelerant to wood in the dark, planning for someone to die inside. I thought about the woman whose name I still did not know, the woman who had ended up in that building, who had been used, that was the only word for it, the way you use a piece of evidence, a prop, something you place somewhere to make a story convincing. She had been someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had been sleeping rough in the San Fernando Valley and had made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time near 2 people who needed a body. The DNA analysis, I said. Michael filed the request last week. How long? The lab said 10 to 14 days, Michael said. We expedited it. Then we wait. I straightened the photographs into a neat stack and slid them back toward Castillo. I want a written report, detailed. Everything you told us this morning with your credentials attached. I want it formatted for use in a federal proceeding. Castillo raised an eyebrow slightly. You're anticipating federal jurisdiction? Wire fraud, I said. Insurance fraud involving an interstate financial institution. If this goes where I think it's going, the Bureau will be involved before spring. I held his gaze. I want your report ready when they ask for it. He nodded once. Closed the document case. Stood. You'll have it by Monday. After he left, Michael and I sat for a moment in the empty conference room. The photographs were gone. The conclusions remained. 2 to 9 for the arson, Michael said. 15 to life if the remains aren't Helen's and someone died in that fire. They're not Helen's, I said. I said it with a certainty I had not earned yet, not completely not, without the DNA result. But I had been building cases for 30 years on the accumulation of small certainties, and every piece I had was pointing in the same direction. We'll have confirmation in 10 days. Michael looked at me for a long moment. And if you're right, I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while Castillo was talking. I drank it anyway. Then we find out where she is, I said, and we go get her. The bank records arrived on a Wednesday morning in the second week of January, delivered electronically to Michael's office through the civil discovery process, 114 pages of transaction history, covering 18 months of Evan Morris's personal and business accounts. Michael called me at 8:15. They're here. Come in when you can. I was there by 9. I had followed money trails for 30 years. Through shell companies and layered transfers through accounts opened under variations of legitimate names, through the patient construction of financial distance between the person who wanted something and the person who took it. I had learned that money, unlike people, cannot lie about where it has been. It can be hidden. It can be routed through structures designed to obscure its movement. But it always leaves a record, and records given enough time, and the right authority can always be found. Evan Morris had not been careful. The first thing I noticed was a storage facility charge, Sylmar Self-Storage Unit 14C, initiated September 3rd, 2 weeks before the fire, paid in cash at the facility, which meant no card trail, but the bank statement showed a corresponding ATM withdrawal of $380 on the same date at a machine 2 blocks from the facility's address. He had withdrawn the cash specifically to pay for the unit. He had done it the same day. He rented the storage unit 2 weeks before the fire, I said. Michael had his reading glasses on, following the same line on his own copy. And look at what comes 4 days later. September 7th. A hardware store in Sylmar Ace Hardware on Hubbard Avenue, 7 blocks from the storage facility. The charge was $212. No itemized receipt in the records, but the amount and the location combined with what Castillo had told us about the accelerant told a story I had heard before, in a different form. Chains, padlocks, industrial materials, I said, or accelerant or both. We'll need the store's transaction records to confirm the items. I've already drafted the subpoena, Michael said. It goes out today. I kept reading. The financial picture that emerged over the following 2 hours was the portrait of a man spending money he did not have on things that required explanation. A van rental not listed under his name, but under a business entity called Pacific Valley Holdings, which a 30-second search of the California Secretary of State database confirmed was registered to Evan Morris at his home address for a period covering September 14th through September 21st. The fire had occurred on September 19th. He had rented the van under a shell company he had apparently created for this purpose and had never used before. I was thinking about all of this, turning the implications in the way you turn a problem when you need to see all its surfaces when my phone rang. Rachel. I looked at the screen for exactly 2 seconds. Then I answered. Dad. Her voice was warm, concerned, calibrated perfectly to the daughter who worried about her aging father. I was just thinking about you. How are you sleeping? Oh, you know, I said. I let my voice go soft, slightly unfocused, the voice of a man whose thoughts moved more slowly than they used to. Some nights are better than others. I was up early this morning, couldn't settle. I'm sorry, Dad. That's hard. A pause. I was thinking of coming by Saturday, bringing some of that soup you like from the place on Colorado. That would be lovely, sweetheart. I was looking at the line item for Pacific Valley Holdings on the bank statement in front of me. The van, September 14th, 5 days before the fire. I'd really like that. Are you eating all right? You sound a little... Just tired, I said. I'm all right. You don't need to worry. She made the sounds of a daughter who would worry anyway. We said goodbye with the warmth of two people who trusted each other completely. When I ended the call, I set the phone face down on the conference table and kept reading. Michael had not looked up from his copy. He had heard enough of my end of the conversation to understand what it was. He said nothing, which was the right thing to say. That afternoon, I drove to Sylmar. I told myself I was not going to do anything. I was going to look. A man can drive on a public road and look at property from outside a fence without breaking any law, and I had not broken any law yet in this investigation, and I did not intend to start. The ranch sat off Sylmar Road behind a chain-link fence with a padlocked gate. From the road, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be an abandoned agricultural property, the kind that appears throughout the San Fernando Valley, weathered structures and overgrown ground, and the general atmosphere of a place that had been useful once and wasn't anymore. A rusted sign near the gate said the property was not for trespassing. The padlock on the gate was new. The chain securing it was new. I sat in my car on the road shoulder for 20 minutes and looked at the fence line, the structures, the ground, looking for the things that didn't fit the story the property was trying to tell. Tire tracks in the dirt near the gate, recent enough that the edges were still sharp. A structure at the far end that looked like it had a basement level, a lower roof line, a grade change, a small ventilation grate visible at ground level near the south wall. I did not get out of the car, but I noted the ventilation grate. I noted the tire tracks. I noted the direction they came from and where they turned. The following morning, I brought the photographs I had taken from the road to Sarah Okafor's office at the Hollywood division. She looked at them. She looked at the bank statement pages Michael had authorized me to share with her, through the civil proceeding, the storage unit, the hardware store, the van rental under Pacific Valley Holdings. Then she pulled up something on her own computer, turned the screen toward me. Traffic camera footage, Sylmar Road at Hubbard, the intersection closest to the ranch. Timestamp. September 18th, 11:47 at night. The night before the fire. A dark-colored van traveling northbound. The plates were partially obscured by road glare, but the vehicle model matched the rental. The driver was not visible through the windshield at that angle, but the van turned off Sylmar Road exactly where the tire tracks at the ranch gate began. Okafor turned the screen back. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at me with an expression that was different from the one she'd worn the first time I sat across from her desk. Mr. Reed. She said, I think it's time I escalated this internally. I think that would be appropriate, I said. Whatever is in that building. She said, we need to know. Yes, I said. We do. And detective, I stopped. I think we need to move quickly. Her jaw tightened slightly. She picked up her phone. Give me until tomorrow morning. Before I tell you what that DNA report revealed, and I promise you nothing could have prepared me for it. Drop a 1 in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Every comment means the world on Revenge Dad. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection and understanding. If this kind of content isn't for you, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all. The lab report arrived on a Tuesday morning at the end of January. Michael called me at 7:52. I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee looking out the window at Helen's rose garden. The roses had gone dormant for the winter. Bare canes brown and skeletal against the fence, waiting for something I was not sure I could give them. It's here, Michael said. I drove to Century City in 26 minutes, a drive that should have taken 40. Michael had printed the report and left it on the conference table without reading ahead of me. That was the kind of man he was. He understood that some things needed to be received in a particular order at a particular pace, and that taking that away from someone, even to spare them a moment's uncertainty, was a form of theft. I sat down. I put on my reading glasses. I read the cover page, which contained the case reference number and the laboratory credentials and the date of analysis. Then I turned to page 2. I have read thousands of lab reports in my career. Financial audits, forensic accounting analyses, transaction records that ran to hundreds of pages. I had learned to move through them efficiently, to find the critical line, absorb its significance, and proceed. Speed was part of the skill. I read this one 4 times. The critical line was in the 3rd paragraph of the findings section. DNA profile obtained from remains recovered at the Sylmar Road fire site does not match the reference profile for Helen Marie Reed, as established from biological samples provided by Thomas Reed Buckle Swab, collected January 3, 2025. The probability of the recovered remains belonging to the reference individual is effectively zero. Effectively zero. I set the report down on the table. I took off my reading glasses. I placed them beside the report, with the same deliberateness I would have used to handle evidence carefully in the right place without unnecessary movement. Helen was not in that urn. Helen had never been in that urn. The gray vessel I had carried into my house and placed on my mantle and spoken to every morning for 4 months. The thing I had pressed my hand against on the worst nights and asked for forgiveness, it contained the remains of someone else entirely. The second page of the report identified who. The recovered DNA profile had been submitted to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which contains genetic profiles collected from individuals with prior criminal records nationwide. CODIS returned a match within 48 hours of submission. Margaret Ann Flores, age 55, no fixed address, San Fernando Valley area. Prior arrest record, 1 count of petty theft, 2019, adjudicated with time served. DNA collected at booking, entered into CODIS per standard California procedure, reported missing by a social services outreach worker on September 9, 2024, 10 days before the fire. I read Margaret Flores' name 3 times. I said it quietly there in the conference room with Michael sitting across from me. Not as a conclusion, not as an entry in an evidence log, as a name. The name of a woman who had been someone before she became a piece of someone else's plan, who had been sleeping rough in the San Fernando Valley trying to survive, and who had crossed paths with my daughter at the worst possible moment. She was reported missing 9 days before the fire, I said. Yes, Michael said, which means Rachel didn't find her by accident. The implications assembled themselves the way they always did, quickly, in order, each one unlocking the next. She identified Margaret Flores in advance. She knew where she was. She planned for her. The room held the weight of that for a moment. Thomas, Michael's voice was careful. This changes the charge structure significantly. We are no longer discussing insurance fraud with an associated arson. We are discussing a homicide. Murder, I said. 2nd degree under the felony murder rule. The arson caused her death. Rachel and Evan are responsible for it, regardless of whether they intended to kill her specifically. I had explained this legal principle to juries more times than I could count. Hearing myself apply it to my own daughter produced a sensation I did not have a precise word for. Not grief, not anger, something colder and more final than either. Call Okafor. She needs to know before she escalates further. This changes what she's escalating. Michael was already reaching for his phone. Okafor arrived at Michael's office 40 minutes later, and she brought someone with her. Diana Reeves was 45 years old, with the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped needing to announce it. She wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt, no jewelry, flat shoes. She showed me her credentials without being asked. FBI Special Agent, Los Angeles Field Office, Wilshire Boulevard. She had been assigned to the case that morning, she said, when Okafor's escalation landed on the right desk. She sat down, opened a small notebook, and looked at me. "Tell me everything, Mr. Reed," she said. "From the beginning. Don't edit for relevance, let me decide what matters." I told her everything. It took 50 minutes. Reeves did not interrupt. She wrote in a small, dense shorthand that I recognized from my own years of field work, the notation of someone who had learned to capture information faster than speech. When I finished, she closed the notebook and looked at the lab report on the table. "Margaret Flores," she said. "Yes. You understand that this is now a homicide investigation. Federal jurisdiction attaches through the wire fraud charges on the insurance payout and the financial transfers, 18 U.S.C. 1343. That brings it to us." She paused. "I want to be direct with you about something. The moment we move on the property in Sylmar, your daughter will know. If your wife is being held there, any action we take needs to guarantee her safety before it guarantees an arrest." "I understand." "Which means we move carefully, and we move together." She held my gaze. "Do not contact Rachel. Do not alter your behavior in any way. Do not go back to that property. A pause. Can you do that? I thought about the ventilation grate at ground level near the south wall, the tire tracks with sharp edges, the dormant roses in my garden that Helen had planted and that I had been neglecting. I can do that, I said. Reeves nodded once. She stood. She picked up the lab report, looked at Margaret Flores' name one more time, and set it back down. We'll be in touch by end of day, she said. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time. Michael had stepped out to make calls. The building was quiet around me. Through the window, Century City spread out in the flat winter light, the towers casting long shadows eastward toward Pasadena, toward home, toward the urn on my mantle that wasn't Helen, toward the roses waiting in the cold. She was alive. After 4 months of grief and guilt and the particular devastation of believing you had failed the person who mattered most, she was alive. She was somewhere in the San Fernando Valley behind a chain-link fence below a ventilation grate I had noted from a car on a public road. And I had promised a federal agent I would wait. I picked up my phone. I did not call Rachel. I did not call anyone. I opened the text thread with Helen's number, the number I had never been able to delete, and I typed a message I did not send. I'm coming. Hold on. Reeves had told me not to go back to the property on Silmar Road. She had not said anything about the property next to it. Frank Delgado's ranch sat on the east side of the fence line, 11 acres of working land, 2 horses, a vegetable garden that had gone mostly dormant for the winter, and a farmhouse that had been built sometime in the 1960s and maintained with the particular care of a man who understood that things lasted as long as you paid attention to them. I found it by pulling the parcel records for the adjacent properties through the county assessor's website, the same public database Michael had used to identify Evan's listing. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon in early February and knocked on the front door. Frank Delgado answered in a canvas work shirt and boots that still had morning mud on them. He was 68 years old, heavy-set with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had learned not to hurry. His face was deeply lined, his hair silver white, his eyes the particular sharp brown of someone who had spent decades paying attention to things other people walked past without seeing. He looked at me for a moment. "You're not from around here?" he said. "No," I said. "My name is Thomas Reed. I'd like to ask you about the property next door." He studied me for another moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee he made, without asking whether I wanted any. Outside the window, I could see the fence line between his property and the abandoned ranch. From his kitchen, the view was clear. The south wall of the main structure, the grade change that indicated a basement level, the ventilation grate at ground level that I had noted from the road 2 weeks earlier. He had been watching that property for months. "I see lights over there at night," he said. "Flashlight kind moving around inside. And a vehicle dark van comes 2 or 3 times a week, always at night, always the same 2 people. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "A blonde woman, younger, and a big man taller than me. They never stay long, an hour, maybe 2. "Did you report it?" I asked. "Called the sheriff's substation on Sayre Street back in November." His jaw tightened slightly. "Deputy came out, looked at the fence from the road, said probably squatters or kids messing around. Said if I saw anything more specific to call back." He paused. "I called back 2 more times, got the same answer both times. But you kept watching. A man lives next to something for 11 years. He knows when something's wrong." He set down the mug. "There's something else." He stood and went to a kitchen drawer near the back wall. He rummaged briefly, then came back to the table and set down a small piece of paper, folded twice the creases worn soft from handling. "Found it about 3 weeks ago," he said, "near the base of my fence post south corner, close to that grate in their wall. Wind must have carried it through." I unfolded it. The paper was torn from what looked like a larger sheet brown, at the edges slightly damp warped. The writing was in pencil, faint but legible, in a hand I recognized the way you recognize a voice on the phone before the person has said their name. HR, alive, basement, help. Helen's H, the small deliberate loop at the upper left corner, the loop that had appeared on every document she had ever signed in our 38 years together. The loop that was absent from the forged beneficiary change form. The loop that was unmistakably completely hers. My hands did not shake. I had trained them not to. But something behind my sternum pulled tight and stayed that way. She had found a stub of pencil. She had torn a piece of paper from what I didn't know, didn't need to know. She had written 4 words, and she had pushed the paper through the ventilation grate and trusted the wind and trusted that someone on the other side would pick it up and hold onto it and eventually find the right person to give it to. She had trusted correctly. "Mr. Delgado," I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "The woman next door. I believe she is my wife." Frank looked at me for a long moment. His expression did not change dramatically. It settled the way a man's face settles when something he has been half expecting finally arrives. "I thought it might be something like that," he said quietly. I folded the paper along its original creases and placed it in my breast pocket. Then I took out my phone and called Diana Reeves. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had. I told her where I was sitting. I told her about Frank Delgado and the ventilation grate and the 3 weeks this piece of paper had been waiting for me in a kitchen drawer on a ranch in Sylmar. Reeves said 4 words before she started giving orders. "We move this weekend." The asset transfer documents arrived Thursday morning, 2 days after I sat at Frank Delgado's kitchen table. Michael had them spread across the conference table. By the time I arrived, 43 pages covering 3 separate transactions, the joint investment account Helen and I had maintained with Vanguard for 19 years, the family trust we had established in 2009 in a parcel of land in Ventura County that Helen had inherited from her mother and that had been titled in her name alone. Combined value just over $1.5 million, all of it bearing Helen's signature. All of it notarized by a man named Roy Haynes. Roy Haynes Michael had established through a quick search of the California notary. Public Registry held a commission issued out of Van Nuys. He had been a licensed notary for 11 years. He was also, according to Evan Morris's phone records obtained through the civil subpoena, a contact Evan had called 14 times in the 8 months preceding the fire. He notarized documents for a woman he never put in front of him, Michael said when he walked me through the Haynes connection. Under California law, a notary is required to physically verify the identity of the signer at the time of notarization. If Helen wasn't present and she was in a basement in Sylmar, then Haynes committed a felony under Penal Code, Section 470B, offering a forged instrument. He'll be looking at charges of his own. "Does he know that yet?" I asked. "Not yet," Michael said, "but he will." I put on my reading glasses and I started at the beginning of the first document, the Vanguard account transfer dated November 14th, nearly 2 months after the fire. Rachel had moved quickly. The money from the insurance payout had cleared in mid-October, and she had used the intervening weeks to begin working through the remaining assets, the ones that required Helen's actual signature, because they predated the forged beneficiary change and couldn't be redirected through insurance alone. That was why Helen was still alive. Rachel needed her. Not out of sentiment, not out of hesitation. She needed a living hand to hold a pen because a dead woman's signature on a notarized document could be challenged, and Rachel was not willing to risk the asset transfers being unwound in probate. She needed Helen breathing and semi-functional and capable of writing her name. And so, she had kept her that way, fed her enough to survive, kept her warm enough to function, brought paperwork and a pen on a schedule calibrated to Helen's diminishing capacity to resist. The recognition of this, the pure cold calculation of it, produced something in me that I did not try to name. I just let it settle into the inventory of things I now knew about my daughter, and I kept reading. I went through the Vanguard transfer first. Helen's signature appeared on page 4 on the authorization line above the notarial seal. It looked at a quick glance like her handwriting. The letter forms were correct. The spacing was consistent with her natural rhythm. I almost turned the page. Something made me stop. I pulled the document closer. I took off my reading glasses, cleaned them on my shirt, and put them back on. I looked at the capital H in Helen. The loop was there. Not absent the way it had been on the forged beneficiary change form Rachel had put in front of us months ago. Present, deliberate. The small curl at the upper left corner of the H that Helen had carried in her handwriting since she taught herself calligraphy 30 years ago. But it was wrong, not missing wrong, slightly too large, slightly too deliberate the way a thing looks when someone is concentrating on making it rather than simply making it. Helen's natural H had the loop the way breathing has rhythm, unconscious, effortless, exactly the same every time. This H had been thought about. I checked the second document. The Family Trust Transfer, page 7. Same H, same loop. Same quality of careful intention. Third document, The Ventura County parcel transferred, page 9. There it was again. 20 years ago, when I was still working active cases and Helen had begun to understand the specific dangers of my work, we had made an agreement. It had begun as a professional precaution, the kind of thing investigators discuss with the people they love, because the alternative is not discussing it and regretting that later. If you are ever forced to sign something under duress, I had told her, make the H wrong, not absent wrong, a loop that's there but slightly off, enough that anyone who wasn't looking for it would miss it, enough that I would see it immediately. She had practiced it twice at the kitchen table, laughing a little at the seriousness of it, saying she hoped she would never need to use it. She had used it. On every document Rachel had put in front of her, on every page and every signature across 3 separate transfers totaling $1.5 million. Months of captivity diminishing food, cold nights, isolation, fear, and she had remembered. Every single time she had picked up that pen, she had remembered. I set the 3rd document down on the table. I did not make a sound. I did not move for a moment. Then I took off my reading glasses and I pressed the heels of both hands against my eyes, and something that had been held in place by the pressure of the past 4 months finally gave way. I cried. Not the way a man cries when he is performing grief. Not the way I had cried in the early weeks when the weeping was real, but also desperate, also frightened. I cried the way you cry when you have been afraid for a very long time, and something has just told you definitively that the thing you were most afraid of did not happen. She was still Helen. After everything Rachel had done to her, everything she had endured in that basement, she was still the woman who had sat at our kitchen table 20 years ago and practiced a secret signal with her husband and laughed about it and remembered it when it mattered most. Michael came back into the conference room and stopped when he saw me. He did not say anything. He sat down across from me and waited the way you wait for someone who needs a moment before they can use words again. After a while, I straightened up. I set the reading glasses back on my nose. I pulled the Vanguard document toward me and placed my finger on the H in Helen's signature. She signed everything wrong, I said. Every page, every document. I looked at Michael. She was telling me the whole time. Michael looked at the signature for a long moment. When he raised his eyes, there was something in his expression I had not seen there before, something that went beyond the professional competence and the strategic calculation and the 40 years of friendship. The forged notarization alone gives us a felony charge on Haynes, he said quietly. Combined with what we have on Rachel and Evan, the wire fraud counts multiply every time one of these transfers was executed electronically. He paused. Thomas, we have enough. We have more than enough. I nodded. I gathered the documents into a neat stack carefully, with the same attention I would give to evidence I intended to present. Then let's finish it, I said. Michael arranged the meetings. 3 of them back-to-back on a Friday morning in early February, the day after I found Helen's distress signal written into every signature on those transferred documents. He had called ahead, explained that we were building a civil case with potential criminal implications, and asked whether each person would be willing to speak with me informally before a potential formal interview with federal investigators. All 3 said yes without hesitation. Dr. Patricia Coleman's practice in Arcadia occupied a small suite on the 2nd floor of a medical building on Duarte Road, the kind of office that had been maintained with enough personal attention over enough years to feel genuinely comfortable rather than institutionally so. She had cleared her first appointment of the morning. When I arrived, she was already at the table in her consultation room with a manila folder open in front of her. I've been waiting for someone to ask me these questions, she said before I had fully sat down. She told me what she knew in the direct, organized way of someone who has been composing a statement in her head for months. Helen was in excellent health at her last physical in June of 2024, 3 months before the fire. Blood pressure, normal cardiac function, normal, no indicators of any condition that would suggest sudden catastrophic failure. Your wife was one of the healthiest 65-year-olds I've treated in 14 years of practice, she said. If I'd been told she died of a stroke, my first question would have been which chart you were reading from. Then she opened the folder. 2 months before the fire, she said, I received a call from Rachel. She said she was trying to understand her parents' health better for planning purposes. Dr. Coleman's expression did not change, but her voice acquired a careful flatness. She asked me specifically about medications or conditions that could produce symptoms resembling a sudden cardiac event or stroke. She said her father had been asking questions about end-of-life planning, and she wanted to be prepared. What did you tell her? I told her those questions were outside the scope of what I could discuss without a patient's authorization, and that she should speak with a specialist if she had specific concerns. She paused. I should have flagged it. I knew it was an unusual question. I told myself she was just an anxious daughter. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong, I said. You followed the right procedure. What you're telling me now is what matters. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded once and closed the folder. I'll provide a full written statement to the federal investigators whenever they're ready. Carol Brennan was waiting in her living room. When I arrived, she had made coffee and set out 2 cups with the automatic hospitality of a woman who had been doing this for 61 years. She sat across from me in the chair she had probably sat in 10,000 times, and she told me what she had been wanting to tell me since the morning she came to my house with flowers. Tom, she said, leaning forward, Helen and I had coffee together the Thursday before she disappeared. She was worried. She didn't tell me everything Helen never told anyone, everything you know that better than I do. But she said Rachel had been calling about the cabin property, insisting there was paperwork that needed handling. She said she'd told Rachel twice she didn't want to go alone, and Rachel kept pushing. Carol wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I told her to wait for you to come home. She said she didn't want to make a fuss over nothing. That she never went to that property alone, I said. In 15 years. Never. Carol said it with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing the word. I can tell you where she went alone and where she didn't, Tom. She drove herself to the market and to church and to the garden center on Foothill. She did not go to that cabin without you. In 15 years, not once. She set down the cup. I should have called you the night she disappeared. I knew something was wrong. I told myself I was overreacting. You tried to tell me when I came home, I said. I didn't let you. She looked at me. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. Is she alive? Yes, I said. Carol pressed her lips together hard. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she straightened in her chair with the composure of a woman who had decided that holding herself together was more useful than falling apart. Tell me what you need from me. The meeting with Sarah Okafor was brief and efficient. 2 people who had moved past the need for reassurance and were now operating on the same side of the same problem. She had spoken with Reeves that morning. The tactical plan for the weekend was being finalized. She had one thing to add. Evan Morris made a purchase at a hardware store in Sylmar on September 7th, she said. We subpoenaed the store's transaction records. The itemized receipt came back yesterday. She slid a document across her desk. I looked at the list. Chain 20 feet half-inch galvanized steel. 2 padlocks heavy duty. Nylon rope 50 feet. Industrial zip ties, pack of 25. Nothing on that list had any legitimate purpose in a man who worked in real estate. The chain, I said, matches the gauge consistent with what Castillo's report described for a basement restraint scenario. Okafor said, We'll confirm on site. She looked at me directly. Mr. Reed, I want to ask you something. When we go in this weekend, and we will go in, I need to know you. Understand that you cannot be there. I know. Not nearby, not parked on the road, not at Frank Delgado's kitchen table. She held my gaze. I understand what this is for you, but if something goes wrong because you were in the vicinity, I'll be at home, I said. I'll wait there. I paused. How long after you go in will you call me? Okafor glanced at the list on her desk, at the chain, at the padlocks. The moment we have a confirmed status, she said. I promise you that. I drove home through the late morning traffic on the 134 through Glendale and into Pasadena, through streets I had driven 10,000 times in 38 years of living in this city. The winter light was flat and pale, the San Gabriel Mountains visible to the north, with a thin line of snow on their upper ridges, something that happened 2 or 3 times a year, and always surprised people who had forgotten that Los Angeles had seasons. I walked in through the front door. I crossed the living room. I stood in front of the fireplace where the gray urn had sat for 4 months. The shelf was empty. I had moved the urn to the hall closet the night Reeves called to tell me Helen was alive. I had not touched it since. I looked at the empty space for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen and I made dinner. A real dinner, not something from a container the way Helen would have made it. And I ate alone at the kitchen table, and I left the chair across from me, Empty, and I told myself it would not be empty much longer. That was Friday. Reeves called me Friday night at 2:47 in the morning. "Mr. Reed," she said. "We found her." The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Reeves spoke in the measured cadence of someone delivering information she had rehearsed, because she understood that the person on the receiving end needed sentences that were clear and complete and left no room for misinterpretation. Helen was alive. She had been found in the basement of the main structure in a space that had been used for cold storage when the property was a working ranch. She was dehydrated and malnourished, and had not walked unassisted in some time, but she was conscious she was speaking, and the paramedics on scene assessed her condition as serious but stable. She was being transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She had asked about me twice before they moved her. "She asked if you were safe," Reeves said. "Both times, before she asked about herself." I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark. I did not turn on a light. I just sat and held the phone and listened to Reeves tell me that the thing I had been most afraid of, the thing I had chosen not to look at in the early weeks because looking at it was too large, had not happened. "Can I go to her?" I asked. "Not tonight," Reeves said. "I need you operational tomorrow. I need Rachel and Evan to believe nothing has changed." A pause. "Thomas, I know what I'm asking." "I know you do," I said. After the call, I sat on the bed for a while longer. The room was dark and quiet. The house was the same house it had been for 4 months. The same walls, the same furniture, the same kitchen where I had made coffee every morning and carried it to a shelf and spoken to an urn that contained someone else's ashes. I got up. I walked to the living room. The shelf above the fireplace was empty. I had moved the urn to the hall closet 2 weeks ago, the night Reeves called to confirm Helen was alive, and somewhere in that property on Silmar Road. I opened the closet now and looked at it for a moment, the gray vessel sitting on the shelf between a winter coat and an old umbrella, the container that had held 4 months of the worst grief I had ever experienced and that had never held my wife. I took it down. I carried it to the garage. I put it in a cardboard box and sealed the box with tape and set it on the shelf above the workbench where it would stay until I could decide what to do with it properly. Then I went back inside, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and waited for morning. At 7:15, Reeves arrived at my house with Michael and 2 agents I had not met, before a man named Cooper and a woman named Diaz, both calm and efficient, both carrying equipment I understood without needing explained. The court order for the recording had been obtained the previous evening, Reeves told me, before the tactical team moved on the Silmar property. Under California Penal Code Section 632, recording a conversation requires the consent of all parties. The court order satisfied that requirement through judicial authorization. Everything that happened in my house today would be captured on a recording that was legally unimpeachable. "Walk me through it again," I said. Reeves set a small device on the kitchen table. "Rachel believes you're an aging man whose grief has impaired his judgment. She's been watching you talk to an urn for 4 months. She believes you are exactly what you appear to be." She looked at me steadily. "I need you to be that man one more time, confused, tired, a little unsteady. You found some of Helen's papers. You're not sure what they mean, but you think there might be money you didn't know about. 2 million, maybe more. You want Rachel's help before your memory gets worse." "She'll come," I said. I was certain of this. I had spent 4 months watching Rachel calibrate her behavior to what she believed I was. I knew exactly how she would hear that call. "She'll bring the transfer documents. She'll want everything signed today." "Good." Reeves nodded. "You call her at 9. We'll be in position." I looked at Michael. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who understood exactly what this cost and had nothing useful to say about it, which was the right response. At 8:55, I picked up my phone. I sat in the kitchen chair where I had sat every morning for 38 years. I thought about Helen in a hospital bed at Cedars-Sinai, asking whether I was safe before she asked about herself. I thought about the distress signal written into 43 pages of transfer documents. I thought about 4 months of talking to an urn. Then I let my voice go soft. The phone rang twice. Rachel answered on the second ring with the bright alertness of someone who had been waiting. "Dad, good morning. How are you feeling?" "Oh, sweetheart." I let a slight waver enter the sound, the particular unsteadiness of a man whose thoughts moved more slowly than they used to. "I'm all right. I've been going through some of your mother's files. You know how I get confused with all these papers. Of course, Dad. Her voice warmed immediately, the temperature shift of a woman who had heard exactly what she had been hoping to hear. What kind of papers? There's a trust account, I said. I don't quite understand it. And there's a number here, it says 2 million, but I can't make sense of the columns. My eyes aren't what they were. I paused, let the pause stretch slightly. I've been thinking, sweetheart. I'd feel so much better if you were handling all of this. Before I forget where I've put things. A silence on the line, 1 second, maybe 2. I could feel her calculating. Dad, she said, I can be there by 10:30. Don't touch anything. I'll take care of it. That would be such a relief, I said. You're so good to me, Rachel. Of course, she said. I'll bring Evan. We'll sort everything out. I ended the call. I set the phone on the table. Reeves was looking at me from across the kitchen. Cooper and Diaz were in position. Michael had his briefcase open. She's coming, I said, in my normal voice. The voice I had used for 30 years in federal buildings and courtrooms and interview rooms, the voice that belonged to the man I actually was. How long? Reeves asked. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. The same clock Helen had hung there in 2003, the one with the slightly loose second hand that made a faint double tick every minute. 90 minutes, I said. Maybe less. I stood up. I straightened my shirt. I walked to the window and looked out at the rose garden, bare canes against the February fence dormant and patient, waiting for the season to change. She'll bring everything, I said. Every document she needs me to sign. She won't be able to help herself. I was not wrong about that. I was not wrong about any of it. 93 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Before I tell you what happened when Rachel walked through that door, comment ready if you're still here. Because what came next, I never could have staged. I never would have wanted to. This story carries fictional elements shaped for reflection and human understanding. If that's not what you're looking for tonight, it's okay to step away. Choose what's right for you. I opened the door. Rachel was smiling. She had a leather portfolio under her arm, and Evan stood just behind her right shoulder with his hands in his jacket pockets and his jaw set at the angle of a man who wanted this done quickly. They looked like two people who had come to help. Dad, Rachel stepped forward and touched my arm. You sounded so tired on the phone. How are you feeling? Better now that you're here, I said. I let my voice stay soft, slightly unfocused. I stepped back and let them in. They moved through the living room, the way people move through a space they expect to own, soon taking in dimensions, noting exits, cataloging. Rachel set her portfolio on the kitchen table and unzipped it. The documents were already organized, tabbed, ready for signature. The Vanguard transfer, the family trust, the Ventura parcel. And beneath those 3 more, I hadn't seen accounts I hadn't known Rachel knew existed. She had been thorough. I'll give her that. Michael sat in the corner, with his briefcase open, playing the role of confused family attorney. Okafor stood near the hallway, half visible. The recording device on the counter looked like a phone charger. I sat down. I picked up the pen Rachel placed in front of me. I let my hand tremble slightly. Dad, just sign where the tabs are, Rachel said. Her voice had the particular gentleness of someone who has decided the obstacle in front of them is manageable. It's simple. I'll explain everything after. I looked at the first page for a long moment. Then I set the pen down. Rachel, I said quietly, are you certain your mother died in that fire? She stiffened. 1 degree, maybe less. Someone who wasn't watching for it would have missed it. Dad, her voice was careful now. We've talked about this. Humor me, I said. Are you certain? Evan moved first. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. Sign the papers, he said. We don't have all day. I looked at him. Not the way I'd been looking at him, the soft, unfocused gaze of an old man losing his grip. The other way. The way I had looked at people across tables for 30 years, when I wanted them to understand that I knew exactly what they were. I'm not signing anything, I said, because I found her Rachel 3 days ago. She's alive. Rachel's face went through several things in quick succession. None of them good. Dad, she started. I went to the property on Silmar Road, I said. I found the man who lives next door. I found a piece of paper she pushed through a ventilation grate. I watched Rachel's face. She wrote 4 words. You want to know what they were? Evan straightened up. This is insane. He's confused Rachel just like we said. She's not confused, said a voice from behind them. The door at the back of the living room opened. Helen walked in. She was supported on the right by a nurse in blue scrubs, and she was thinner than I had ever seen her, thinner than I had thought a person could become and still be standing, and her face was pale in the particular way of someone who had not seen enough sunlight in a very long time. But her eyes were clear, and she was looking directly at Rachel with an expression I had never seen on her face before in 38 years. Not anger, something past anger, something that had gone all the way through anger and come out the other side into a place that was very quiet and very certain. Rachel made a sound I cannot describe. Evan turned toward the front door. 2 federal agents appeared in the doorway before he had taken a step. Helen looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that was smaller than I remembered, but steadier than it had any right to be, "I signed everything wrong, Rachel. Every single page. Did you ever check?" Rachel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Okafor stepped forward. I heard the words, "You are under arrest," and I heard the click of handcuffs, and I heard Rachel say, "Dad, please," in a voice that broke in exactly the right places, and I understood that even now, even here, she was performing. I stood up. I crossed the room. I took Helen's free hand in both of mine, and I held on. She turned to look at me. Her eyes filled. She said my name, just Tom, nothing else, and I said, I know, I've got you." Behind us, they led Rachel and Evan out the front door. I did not watch them go. After they led Rachel and Evan out the front door, the house was the quietest it had ever been. Not the quiet of an empty house I had lived in, that quiet for 4 months, and I knew its specific weight. This was different. This was the quiet of something finished. The air had been holding its breath for a long time and had finally carefully let it go. Michael stayed 20 minutes. He confirmed the arraignment timeline before he left, under California. Law Rachel and Evan would appear before a federal magistrate within 48 hours of booking formal charges read bail set or denied. Given what they faced, denial was near certain. He put his hand on my shoulder, then he left. I sat at the kitchen table alone. The outlet on the counter where the recording device had been plugged in was still there. Cooper and Diaz had taken the equipment, but I kept looking at that outlet the way you look at a place where something important happened after the thing itself is gone. I thought about Rachel's voice on that recording, warm, certain. "I'll take care of it. I'll bring Evan. We'll sort everything out." The voice of a woman who had looked at her father's grief and seen an opportunity. I had spent 30 years studying people who did that, who looked at vulnerability and saw leverage. I had always believed I understood them. Sitting in that kitchen, I understood something else. Understanding something and surviving it are not the same thing. I cleared the table, put Rachel's documents in a folder, evidence now, not paperwork, washed the cups, turned off the lights, walked through the rooms the way I had walked through them 1,000 times, checking locks, turning things off. Except, it was not quite my house anymore. It was a house where my daughter had sat across from me and lied to my face for 4 months. I went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. Reeves called at 7:45 Sunday morning. "She's asking for you," Reeves said. "Medical team says she's stable, no time limit." I was in the car 11 minutes later. The nurse at the 4th floor station looked at me with the expression of someone who had been briefed. "Room 419, she's been awake since 6. The door was half open. I stopped outside it for a moment. I had not seen Helen alone, just the 2 of us. No agents, no arrest happening behind us since the morning I kissed her goodbye in the driveway in August. I pushed the door open. She was sitting up in the bed, hands folded in her lap, thinner than I had ever seen her. Her face had the hollowness of someone who had not eaten properly in a long time. An IV line ran into her left arm. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, exactly the same, the clear gray-green I had spent 38 years learning to read. "Tom," she said, just my name, the way she had said it for 38 years. I sat in the chair beside her bed and took both her hands in mine and held them carefully the way you hold something you were afraid you would never hold again. Outside, Beverly Boulevard was waking up cars, a bus, an ordinary Sunday morning in Los Angeles. Inside the room, it was very still. "She told me you had already received the ashes," Helen said. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, slightly rough. "Rachel said that every time she brought paperwork. Thomas has the ashes. No one is looking for you anymore." A pause. I didn't believe her. "I know," I said. "I thought if I could get one message out, you would find it." She looked at our hands. You were always so good at finding things. I pressed her hands between mine. The roses, I said, finally. She looked up. Jimmy Cortez heard you. He kept the necklace. He told me what you said. I watched her face. That's how I found you. Something moved through her expression, relief, exhaustion, and underneath it all, something that looked like quiet satisfaction. I knew someone would hear it, she said. A pause. I'm very tired, Tom. Sleep, I said. I'll be here. She leaned back. She did not let go of my hands. Within 10 minutes, her breathing had slowed, and she was asleep, her face finally, for the first time, in however long it had been at rest. I sat beside her and did not move. Outside, Los Angeles went about its Sunday. Inside room 419, I began the work of learning how to be a husband again, instead of a hunter. It was the harder job. It was also the better one. The trial began on September 8th, 2025. 7 months had passed since the morning in my kitchen, when Helen walked through the back door and Rachel's face went white. 7 months of arraignments and preliminary hearings and motions and counter-motions of Rachel's attorney arguing insufficient evidence, and Evan's attorney arguing that his client had been coerced of the two of them, my daughter and her husband, spending those months in a federal detention facility in downtown Los Angeles, unable to make bail on charges that included kidnapping for extortion and second-degree murder. I sat in the third row of the gallery every morning, same seat, same cup of coffee I never fully finished. I did not miss a single session. I told myself it was because I wanted to see it through. The truer answer was that I owed it to Margaret Flores, whose photograph I had found online after learning her name, a woman in her mid-50s, dark hair, a smile that looked like it had survived a great deal, and whose image I had looked at once and not allowed myself to forget. The charges were read on the first day by the Assistant United States Attorney, a precise woman named Caroline Webb, who had the economical delivery of someone who understood that the facts required no embellishment. Felony arson, California. Penal Code 451. Second-degree murder under Penal Code 189, the felony murder rule, which holds that a death caused during the commission of arson constitutes murder regardless of specific intent to kill. Kidnapping for extortion under Penal Code 209. Torture under 206. Elder financial abuse under Penal Code 368, subsection B. Helen was 65 years old, the threshold precisely met. Wire fraud under federal statute 18 U.S.C. 1343, 14 separate counts. One for each electronic transfer executed using her forged signatures. Forgery. Wrongful use of human remains under California Health and Safety Code. Section 7052. Rachel and Evan entered not guilty pleas through their separate attorneys. Both had apparently decided during those 7 months that the optimal strategy was to make this about each other. That strategy lasted approximately 4 days. Frank Delgado testified on the third day. He wore a pressed white shirt and took the stand with the unhurried dignity of a man who had been waiting to say something true for a long time. He described the lights in the van and the 2 figures he had seen over his fence for months. He described the morning he found the piece of paper near the ventilation grate, the call to the Sylmar Sheriff's substation, the deputy who had come and looked and concluded it was probably nothing. He described keeping the paper in his kitchen drawer for 3 weeks because something told him it mattered, even if he couldn't prove it yet. The prosecutor held up the evidence bag containing the torn piece of paper. The jury looked at it. HR, alive. Basement, help. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment. Jimmy Cortez testified on the 4th day. He wore the same jacket he had worn when I found him under the Sepulveda overpass, clean, well-maintained, the kind of garment a man keeps, because it represents something about who he intends to be. He described September with the precision of a former infantry sergeant, the night the fence line, the dark van, the 2 figures, and the older woman whose feet dragged on the ground. He described her turning her head before the door closed the way she said it twice, as if she understood she might not have another chance. Tom the Roses. A juror in the second row, a woman in her 60s I noticed who had been taking notes throughout the trial, set down her pen when Jimmy said those words. She did not pick it up again for several minutes. Dr. Patricia Coleman testified about Helen's health and about the phone call Rachel had made 2 months before the fire, asking about medications that could simulate cardiac events. Carol Brennan testified about 15 years of knowing where Helen went and where she did not. Robert Castillo testified about 2 ignition points and liquid accelerant and the measured difference in his field between what accidents look like and what decisions look like. Roy Haynes, who had accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for 3 years probation and the permanent surrender of his notary commission, testified about 14 phone calls from Evan Morris about signing documents for a signer who was not present about understanding now, with full clarity, what those documents had been used for. He did not look at Rachel when he testified. She looked at him constantly with an expression I recognized as the same one she had worn in my kitchen the morning everything came apart, the expression of someone recalculating in real time. Helen testified on the 9th day. She came in on a cane. She had been in a wheelchair when they brought her out of that basement in February, and on a walker by April, and had graduated to the cane in late June after a particularly determined week of sessions with Brianna, her physical therapist, who had the stubborn optimism of someone who had never met a patient she was willing to give up on. 7 months of work, and Helen walked into that courtroom on her own, 2 feet, and sat in the witness chair and folded her hands on the rail and looked at the prosecutor with the expression of a woman who had decided a long time ago in a cold basement that if she got out, she was going to say exactly what happened. She told them everything: the chain, the single bulb, the food that came once a day enough to keep her functional, calibrated with a precision that was in its way more frightening than simple cruelty. Rachel arriving with documents and a pen, explaining in careful tones that Thomas had already received the ashes, that no one was looking, that it would be better for everyone if Helen simply cooperated. The days Helen refused, and the days the food was less. The decision each time Rachel placed a pen in her hand to sign it wrong, to add the loop, to leave the signal in every signature across 43 pages of documents, because a woman she had been married to for 38 years had taught her how 20 years earlier at a kitchen table on an ordinary evening, and she had not forgotten. She did not look at Rachel during her testimony. When she finished and stepped down, and the bailiff offered his arm, she declined it. She walked back past the gallery under her own power. She found my eyes as she passed the 3rd row, and she gave me the same small nod she had given me in the hospital in February, the one that meant I've still got it. I'm still here. I gave it back. The recording from my kitchen was played on the 10th day. Rachel's voice filled the courtroom, warm and reassuring, and completely without hesitation. I'll be there by 10:30. Don't touch anything. I'll take care of it. Her attorney objected to its admission 6 times. All 6 objections were overruled. The recording had been made under a court order, obtained before the tactical team moved on Silmar, which made it legally unimpeachable regardless of California's 2-party consent requirements under Penal Code 632. On the 11th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. Rachel was found guilty on all counts. Evan was found guilty on all counts except torture. The jury determined that his role, while substantial, did not meet the specific intent requirement of Penal Code 206 and was convicted of false imprisonment under Penal Code 236 instead. The judge sentenced Rachel to 23 years in a federal correctional facility. Evan received 20 years. Roy Haynes received 3 years of probation and a permanent bar from notarial practice in the state of California. I sat in the 3rd row, and I listened to the numbers, and I waited to feel something I recognized. I had spent 30 years believing that the sentence was the point, that the work justified itself in the outcome, that the moment the gavel came down was the moment everything that preceded it acquired its meaning. I understood sitting in that gallery that I had been slightly wrong about that for a long time. The sentence was not the point. The sentence was just the last piece of paperwork in a file that had been building since the night Rachel changed a beneficiary form and decided her mother's life was a cost she was willing to pay. The point was Helen walking past the 3rd row on her own 2 feet. The point was 4 words on a torn piece of paper. I stood when the gallery was dismissed. I filed out with the other observers into the marble corridor of the federal courthouse on Spring Street, and I stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light while people moved around me. And I thought about a woman named Margaret Flores, who had been buried in April in a county plot in Van Nuys, attended by 3 social workers and a chaplain, with no family present because none had been found. I had sent flowers, white ones, because I didn't know what she had preferred, and white seemed like the kind of choice that couldn't be wrong. After the verdict, I drove to the cemetery directly before going to Helen. before going home, before doing anything else. And I stood at the marker and I said her name once out loud because it seemed like the least I could do for a woman who had become a piece of evidence before anyone had thought to ask who she was. Then I got back in the car and drove to Cedars-Sinai, where Helen was waiting. The afternoon of the verdict, I drove straight to Cedars-Sinai. Helen was sitting up in bed when I walked into her room, working on a crossword puzzle with the focused dissatisfaction of someone who had encountered a clue she considered unfair. She looked up. "How did it go?" 23 years, I said. She set the pencil down. She did not speak for a moment, not because she had nothing to say, but because some things need time to settle before you can speak around them properly. Then she reached out and took my hand, and we sat like that in the late afternoon light coming through the hospital window, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, the quiet between us felt like something we had earned, rather than something that had been left behind. Brianna, her physical therapist, believed with cheerful and unshakable conviction that every patient who came through her door would eventually walk out of it. She applied this conviction to Helen with a relentlessness that Helen initially found irritating and later came to depend on. I was there for every session, every setback, every morning. Helen gripped the parallel bars and decided to try again. The parking attendant in the third-floor structure at Cedars-Sinai had learned my name by April. By June, Helen was on a cane. By August, she was leaving it in the car for short walks. On a Thursday in October, 3 days after the verdict, she walked the length of the hospital corridor without assistance. 42 steps. I counted every one. Brianna started clapping from the far end. Helen told her to stop because it was embarrassing. Then she laughed the real laugh, the one I had not heard in more than a year, the one that started in her chest and came out slightly surprised at itself. I stood at the other end of the corridor and did not try to speak. We sold the Pasadena house in November. It was the right decision, and I had known it since February, but knowing and being ready are not the same thing. 31 years in those rooms. The kitchen where she made coffee every morning and left the mug on the left side of the sink even though the dishwasher was on the right. The garden she talked to. The fireplace shelf that had held an urn for 4 months and been empty for 9. I walked through it one last time on the day of closing alone while Helen waited in the car. I said goodbye to each room the way you say goodbye to versions of yourself you no longer need to be. Then I locked the door and left the key on the counter and walked out. We bought a small house in Ojai, 90 minutes north of the city, orange blossoms and spring afternoon light that made everything look like it was painted by someone who loved the place. The yard had been waiting for someone to decide what it was supposed to become. Helen decided on the second day. She ordered rose catalogs from the hospital, marked the pages in pencil, and planted on her knees in the November dirt new varieties, not the ones from Pasadena. New ones, for a new yard, for a life that was not the old one resumed, but something different that had grown from the same roots. I watched from the porch. She talked to them while she worked. She always had. The Roses Fund came together through the fall. Michael had suggested it in September during the civil asset recovery proceedings. A criminal conviction for elder financial abuse under California law supports a civil action for treble damages, and the combination of the insurance fraud recovery and the treble damage award produced a sum that Michael described with characteristic understatement as meaningful. Helen named the fund the morning after I told her what Jimmy Cortez had heard her say through the fence. She sat with it for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window. Then she said, "That's what we call it." The fund provided legal and financial assistance to elderly Californians who had been defrauded by family members. Michael incorporated it as a California nonprofit public benefit corporation and filed the tax-exempt application. We seeded it with the recovered funds. By December, it had its first 3 clients. The opening ceremony was on a Saturday morning in mid-December. Folding chairs, coffee winter light flowers from our yard in mason jars. Frank Delgado drove up from Sylmar in a recently washed truck and wore the same pressed white shirt he had worn to testify. He shook my hand and held on longer than a handshake usually requires. And I thought about a piece of paper in a kitchen drawer, and 3 weeks, and an instinct that told him it mattered. Jimmy Cortez arrived with his sister Maria. He wore the courtroom jacket clean maintained. I understood he had kept it for the same reason I kept certain things. I took his hand in both of mine. "You saved her life," I said. He shook his head thoughtfully. "You would have found her anyway. The necklace, the missing report, you were already on it." "Maybe," I said, "but you saved time. And when someone is in a basement, time matters in a way it doesn't usually matter." He considered that. Then he nodded once and went inside. Helen spoke for 4 minutes without notes. She talked about the basement and the pen and what it meant to have a husband who had taught her 20 years earlier at an ordinary kitchen table how to leave a message inside her own signature. She talked about the moment she understood that someone was looking not as a hope, but as a certainty, the way you know certain things about a person you have been married to for almost 4 decades. She did not cry. Several other people did. That evening we sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the Topa Topa Mountains. Helen had her watercolors set on the small table beside her. She was painting the roses she had planted 6 weeks earlier, bare cane dormant, not yet what they were going to be. But in the painting they were in full bloom, deep red, the color she had decided on before she even knew what the yard looked like. "I talked to that urn every morning," I said. "For 4 months." She kept painting. "I know, I could hear you, in my heart." "Did it help?" She set down the brush. She looked at the real roses in the ground bare and patient, waiting for a season that was certain to come. "It helped me remember that someone was looking," she said. "That you were out there and you were looking and you were going to find me." She picked up the brush again. "That was everything, Tom. That was the whole thing." The mountains went dark. Helen kept painting. I thought about the last line she had written in her diary on the floor of her study, with the orchid above her still holding its single bloom. "I'm not as brave as you think I am." She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about that from the moment she turned her head in the dark in Silmar and said the name of our roses into the night, trusting that someone on the other side of a fence would hear her. She had been wrong about it every day for 8 months in a basement. She was still wrong about it now, painting roses in full bloom while the real ones waited in the ground. I did not correct her. She would figure it out. She always did. The roses will bloom in April. This family story changed everything I thought I knew about love and blindness. I was a federal investigator for 30 years. I caught liars for a living, and yet family betrayal walked into my house, sat at my table, and I handed it a check. Don't be like me. Don't let grief shut down the part of you that asks questions. Don't let love become the reason you stop paying attention, especially with money, especially with family. God gave me the instincts to find the truth. I chose for months not to use them. That is on me. My personal belief family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly dressed in concern, offering to help. And family story, the real one, the one worth keeping, is built by the people who stay honest with you, even when it costs them something. This family story taught me that the people we love are not always where we think they are. Go find them and pay attention. If something in this family story stayed with you, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying with me until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best.